Hello, welcome to this edition of Ros Atkins On here on BBC iPlayer. If you're a regular viewer, you'll know that every week we look in depth at one issue in the news, and this time it's rising tensions in Eastern Europe, because many people watching the region right now are asking, is Russia going to invade Ukraine?
The answer is I don't know. I think we have to be on our guard, and I think we have to make sure that deterrence prevails.
The UK's most senior military officer doesn't know. Vladimir Putin has the West guessing. But what everyone knows is that tension is rising. The EU and Russia have been blaming each other for the migrant crisis on the Belarus-Poland border. There's also been a major build-up of Russian troops near the border with Ukraine. And America is watching.
We do continue to see unusual military activity and concentration of forces in Russia, but near Ukrainian borders, and that remains concerning to us.
We've also heard one Ukrainian minister warning of the high probability of destabilization of the situation in Ukraine this winter. Vladimir Putin calls these fears alarmist, though Russia did invade Georgia in 2008, and we know more broadly Putin does want to test the West. To understand how and why he's doing that, well, Ukraine is the place to start. It was once part of the Soviet Union, and even after independence in 1991, it remained an ally of Russia's. But the relationship frayed, and in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine and made a military incursion into the east of Ukraine to support separatists. For that, Russia was booted out of the G8 group of rich countries and faced economic sanctions too. But it didn't back down. And now, this year, this has been happening. First in the spring, thousands of Russian troops were sent towards the border with Ukraine. Now in November, another build-up is happening, and Ukrainian officials estimate that 114,000 troops have been deployed. And Vladimir Putin will be well aware that the US continues to watch.
We've seen in the past Russia mass forces on Ukraine's borders, claim some kind of provocation by Ukraine, and then invade, basically following through on something they were planning all along. That's what they did in 2014.
If that's the US, Ukraine too says it's learnt lessons.
He did the same 7 years ago in Crimea. Then he recognized that actually they snatched this peninsula from us and not 2 million people. So we're not that easily fooled this time.
Vladimir Putin knew his actions in Ukraine in 2014 would bring sanctions and condemnation, but he had his reasons. We can see one of them in this article in July. President Putin wrote, "I said that Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. Those words were not driven by some short-term considerations or prompted by the current political context. It's what I have said on numerous occasions and what I firmly believe." And certainly one of his motivations is a desire to maintain the alliances, influence and cultural connections that are rooted in Russia's history. But for all that, this is also about security. Have a look at this map from the website of the defence alliance NATO. There's Russia in the east, and then the light blue coloured countries are all NATO members. Ukraine, well, it's not a NATO member, but it gets major military support from the US and others. And all of this is too close for comfort for Putin. In his eyes, it requires a response. Keep that in mind as we consider how the US is now connecting the current Russian troop build-up and another escalating situation. Here's a recent tweet from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He describes a hybrid campaign on the Poland-Belarus border, which seeks to threaten security, sow division, and distract from Russia's activities on the border with Ukraine. And to understand why the Americans are making that connection, we need to look at Belarus.
This story is a very human drama, but the backdrop, that's geopolitics.
That's the BBC's Steve Rosenberg in Belarus this week. This country was also once part of the Soviet Union, but unlike Ukraine, Belarus remains an ally of Russia. Presidents Lukashenko and Putin know each other well. That's relevant as we look at the crisis on the border between Poland and Belarus. Poland's in the European Union, and the EU accuses Lukashenko of encouraging migrants to use Belarus as a route into the EU. Now, Lukashenko denies that, but thousands have come in desperate conditions have tried to get into Poland. Other EU countries are affected too. Lithuania and Latvia have also seen a rise in illegal crossings from Belarus. And for the Polish Prime Minister, this isn't only about Belarus and the EU, it's about Russia.
This attack, which Lukashenko is conducting, has its mastermind in Moscow. The mastermind is President Putin.
Now, others disagree with that, saying this is simply Lukashenko taking revenge for EU sanctions on Belarus. And whether Russia is or isn't the mastermind, it's certainly involved in this crisis. Vladimir Putin's spoken to Angela Merkel on the phone twice. Perhaps mischievously, he's offering to mediate. And this analyst argues this is exactly where Putin wants to be.
He wants to be seen as a power broker in Europe. He already had 2 calls by Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany to the Kremlin asking to help in this crisis. That's exactly what he wants. He wants to boost up his importance in Europe.
This is one possible explanation for Putin's approach. Lithuania's president goes further.
It is totally clear what the Lukashenko regime and their allies are seeking: to test the unity of the West.
Not that Russia is having that. One official dismissed the West thinking as keep calm and blame Russia. But Russia does have a track record of testing the West. It did so in Crimea, it did so in Georgia, it even did so in space this week by destroying a satellite in a missile test, much to NATO's irritation. And here in the UK, the Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood sees another test coming.
Is this going to be the moment where we are going to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, or are we going to step back and allow Russia to advance once again, as it did in Crimea, as it did in Georgia as well? And it's not just Russia that will be looking to see how the West, how the United States, how Britain, how the EU reacts, but it's also China as well.
Everyone is watching, and this isn't just about military might, because to understand Putin's plans, we also need to think about energy too. This is the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. It runs from Russia all the way to Western Europe, but it's not switched on yet. In fact, Germany's just delayed giving it the okay. But here it is, stretching under the Baltic Sea, and when it's on, it'll increase Europe's reliance on Russian gas. To Boris Johnson, that's a problem.
A choice is shortly coming between mainlining ever more Russian hydrocarbons in giant new pipelines or sticking up for Ukraine and championing the cause of peace and stability.
Reliance on Russian gas is one security concern, but there's another. Nord Stream 2 will reduce the volume of gas that's delivered to Western Europe via Ukraine, and Ukraine believes that's dangerous.
If Nord Stream 2 is launched and the status of Ukraine as a transit country is not guaranteed, then Ukraine becomes more vulnerable in terms of its security and more vulnerable to potential Russian aggressive actions.
As we're hearing, most issues in this part of Europe have a security dimension, and if NATO's unimpressed with Russia's actions, the feeling's mutual.
We need to consider that Western partners worsen the situation. They deliver modern, lethal weapons to Kiev and have provocative exercises in the Black Sea and other regions close to our borders.
Putin sees a serious challenge in the West's military proximity. In part, he views his actions as defensive. And if that helps us understand what he's doing, so does this from April.
I hope no one will cross Russia's red line, but in each case we are the ones who will decide where the red line is. Organisers of any provocation threatening our security will regret it, like they have not regretted anything for a long time.
Here we see the aggressive dimension to Putin's approach. He asserts that Russia will set the rules and enforce them. And this all connects to the broader goal of Putin's leadership, to establish Russia as a global force. To do that, Putin wants to test the limits of Western power. What we don't know is what he wants to happen next. Don't forget, you can see all of the previous editions of the series here on BBC iPlayer. You can also find our videos on the BBC News website, or if you prefer to listen, you can find audio editions of them on BBC Sounds, and you can subscribe there. So lots of different ways to find them across the BBC. If you search for my name, that's probably the easiest way to locate them. That is it for this week's edition. I hope you found it helpful. We'll see you next week. All the best.